All right, welcome to it. Live Convention 19. We're over at the record show today, the Cratery Record Exchange. And I want to welcome y'all to our talk with Alan Thayer, journalist, author, and the person who wrote this book right here, Tim Maia, Rationale. I just said it wrong. Tim Maia, Rationale. I'm so used to, shout out to my man K Wonder, man. He got me pronouncing this joint all wild, man. It's not Tim Maia, it's Tim Maia. Rationale, Volume 1 and 2. Truly one of the most interesting and kind of holy grail albums in Brazilian funk and soul music. And I'm just happy that, Alan, that you brought this to the 33 1/3 Pantheon, because, there's a lot of books in this series, all kinds of different, great albums. But this one is a sort of a cult classic, no pun intended. And we can get into the sort of the details behind that album shortly. So let's talk a little bit about your interest in this album and how your interest in this record kind of came to be.
Well, I started listening to Brazilian music probably towards the end of high school, and it was around the same time that I was really getting into soul music also, just getting into the back catalog of your Stevie Wonders, your James Browns, what have you. And then a couple years later, digging a little deeper, I chanced on Tim Maia, and I was like, what? There's literally Brazilian music that is also soul music. There's Brazilian soul music, and then that became sort of, the thing that I was obsessed about from then on out, trying to figure out, which artists were part of that, and stumbling upon Tim early on, made a lot of sense because he is, I describe him to people that don't know as the James Brown of Brazil. He's the beginning point upon which everything is built. You can't have hip hop, you can't have soul, you can't have funk without James Brown. Same can be said of Tim Maia in Brazil in terms of Brazilian soul, Brazilian funk, Brazilian hip hop, and everything that came from it. Ground zero of Tim Maia.
So before we jump into this album, let's talk a little bit about Tim Maia, the man, the myth, the artist, the sort of the legend, the reputation a little bit of Tim Maia. This album is very different than most of the albums in his catalog. So let's talk a little bit about him as him and his artist and his beginnings sort of before he got to this record.
Sure. So he has been in the music game since the late 50s in Brazil, but didn't put out his first record until 1970. So he was in the mix. He moved to the U.S. for a number of years. He came back. He spent some time in jail in Rio. He tried to get put on by his friends Roberto Carlos and Erasmo Carlos, who, if you're deep into Brazilian music, know that these guys are sort of like the Elvis Presley and the Neil Diamond of Brazil, to use loose terms, but like big figures, big pop figures. But it was hard for him to sort of make it in Brazil once he knew the sound that he wanted to do. And his time in the U.S. Showed him that there was this thing called soul music that was developing. And it really spoke to him in terms of his interest in music coming from sort of a rock and roll oriented background. But when he came back to Brazil, trying to introduce this sound, no one was listening to soul music because it was, imagine the 60s, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have the radio, there's international, it was really dependent on the record labels importing certain records. And that's what people would hear. And so he was trying to introduce a sound that had not made it to Brazil yet. So it made it extra hard. But eventually, after really working at it for a number of years, he had a breakthrough. 1970, he sang on a guest spot on a record by Elis Regina, who's a big figure in Brazilian soul music, a song of his called These Are the Songs. And she liked his song so much that she recorded his song, but she liked the way he sang it so much that she had him join her, on a duet. So it's like, it's like being pulled in by Beyonce to do a guest track, it's like, it's gonna make your career at that point.
So there's always, there's sort of been this trend of, like artists at that time in Brazil also recording for multiple labels. And right before these Rationale albums came out, Tim was actually, had signed a contract with RCA. Can you tell us a little bit about the sort of early, recordings with RCA during this time and sort of what would eventually become the Rationale albums?
Sure. So Tim signed his initial record contract for his first 4 LPs with Polydor, and it was Philips Polydor at the time. And so his first 4 records came out on Polydor Records, and he was making a lot of money for Polydor. Polydor was killing it in that era. Same record label as Caetano and Georgie Ben and Elis Regina. I mean, he was in good hands at that time. And so when he came around to getting ready for his 5th solo record, you know, it's 1973 going into 74, and it's the era of the double album. So he had it in his head that he wanted to do a double album. And, you know, Milton Nascimento had already done a double album, but there had never been a Brazilian soul or funk double album at that time. And so he demanded this of Polydor. And they said, thanks, but we'll pass. Because he was, as much as he was he was a good money maker for them, he was also known as being extremely difficult to work with as an artist, and would create a lot of troubles. He would, you know, storm the record executive's office and literally like destroy stuff. And he was also known to, he came back after a trip to the UK with a bunch of sheets of acid and went around the office and literally gave a dose to everyone in the office while taking one himself each time before driving back home in his Jeep. Yeah, and so he was a liability on a lot of levels. So when he came and had this demands, he wanted this much money and he wanted a double album, Polydor was like, we'll let you, you know, go find that somewhere else. And he did. He found it with RCA, which is, you know, international record label, and they didn't have a good, a whole lot of big stars in that sort of, in that new nascent soul and funk scene. So they took him up on it and they promised him the double album. They gave him a record advance of, you know, something like $300,000, which at the time was a huge amount of money. That's a huge amount of money,
yeah, back then for sure.
And they had just opened a brand new studio in Botafogo, which is a neighborhood right behind Copacabana in Rio de Janeiro, which was a state-of-the-art recording studio. I want to say it was at least 8 tracks, 73, 74, I'm not sure if 16 track was an option at that point. But anyway, it was the state-of-the-art at the time. And he was his own record producer at the time. That was part of his deal, is that, you know, he would produce the record and sell it then to, you know, and give it to the company when he was done. So he signed with RCA and they started going, and they were in the studio every day, all night, whenever, you know, rolling tape nonstop for probably, you know, 6 to 8 months before this whole Rationale thing cropped up. And so what ended up becoming Rationale Volumes 1 and 2 started out as a Tim Maia RCA double album that probably would have been self-titled.
Tim Maia and Tim Maia.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the
Disc
double
1,
album.
Disc
1, Disc 2. Oh, or maybe Disc 1 is Tim and Disc 2 is Maia.
Yeah.
So did some of those original, like, sort of recordings from that era ever, like, survive? Like, is there versions of, like, the Rationale album, like, without, like, the actual Rationale, like, lyrics on them? Like,
sadly, no. What ended up happening is that around this time when he was recording the album, that's when he got introduced to the book. And these are copies of the book here in English and in Portuguese. Universo in Desencanto, Universe in Disenchantment. And he stumbled upon one of these books hanging out at a friend's house and got really into it. Ended up going to the you know, the basically the compound where this religious organization, they don't like to be called a cult, but come on now, it's, you know, by any other terms you would call it a cult. But I did have the opportunity to meet with representatives from it, and I got it from them that they're not a fan of that term. So you know, I just put it out there. But he got really into it, and then what ended up happening is that the albums that he was developing, these double albums, which had scratch vocals, that was his methodology. He'd work on the music first, and then he would develop scratch vocals that he would sort of sing along to. And there were definitely versions that had been recorded where the scratch vocals had been recorded to the tape. But when he switched over, he literally recorded over all the vocal tracks. So sadly, there's no versions available anywhere because they were literally dubbed over of the Rationale lyrics were dubbed over the secular lyrics that were being developed. So there's not a lot of great examples that the other musicians can remember, but the one that often comes up is the song off of Rationale Volume 2 called Quer Queria, Quer Now Quera, which means if you like it or not. That originally was a song called Adios San Juan del Puerto Rico. And it was, basically a boy meets girl in Puerto Rico love song set to a sort of a funky Latin beat. And it got changed to like it or not, you're gonna read the book. So totally, night and day conceptually. But
Right.
the track itself, entirely the same. And that's the important thing to note is that the tracks that were being recorded for the RCA double album, the music always stayed the same. That never changed when the lyrical part came
Well,
on.
yeah, and that's why I was curious to know if there were still recordings of what the original sort of believers cult version of the album, was released. How did Tim fall into this, and can we talk a little bit about what rational culture is or rationale
Sure,
culture is,
sure.
and how Tim kind of fell into this?
So, I mean, that was the biggest thing I wanted to figure out when I was writing the book is sort of like, why? Why did Tim get into this stuff? And then ultimately, why did he leave, after a pretty short period of time? And I have some conjectures, but Tim died in 1997, so I didn't have a chance to ask him directly. And the closest I got was a number of his bandmates and his friends who were around at the time. And in fact, the guy who introduced him to the book is a guy by the name of Tiberio Gaspar. And he passed away just a couple of years ago, within 6 months of me actually interviewing him. I can't believe I got the opportunity to meet the guy. And he's an important figure in Brazilian music for a number of reasons. He was the lyrical partner for Antonio Adolfo with the Antonio Adolfo and Brazuca records. And those were huge records in Brazil at the time.
Great records.
Everybody covered those songs, and Tiberio Gaspar wrote the lyrics to all of them. But he was also a really close friend of Tim Maia's. And his father was a very super brainiac mathematician, theoretical mathematician. And it was Tiberio's father who got into rational culture and was really close to the founder, Manuel Jacinto Coelho. And through that, Tiberio had a copy of the book. And so the story goes is that Tim Maia went over to go hang out at Tiberio's house one day in 1974. And while Tiberio was taking a shower and Tim was waiting for him in the living room, imagine this is the coffee table, and he's just sitting out waiting around, he sees this book, and it's got this trippy looking cover on it, and he kind of is like, what's this about? And he just starts reading it. And Tim evidently always was a big fan of UFOs and extraterrestrial theories, and it was the 70s. It was a big subplot going on around that time, I think, documenting these ideas. And so he gravitated towards the stories in it and wanted to know more. Now, ultimately, why he ended up joining full on, my theory is that Tim was the most charismatic person he knew for his entire life, basically. Like, there was no one more captivating. I think until he met this guy, Manuel Jacinto Coelho. And this guy was 6.5 feet tall. He was an Afro-Brazilian. He used to work in the foreign, basically the Brazilian State Department. He was also a traditional healer, herbs and all sorts of traditional remedies. He was a preacher in the Umbanda, Afro-Brazilian faith. He also played a mean guitar. He could do it all. He was an autodidact and understood all sorts of stuff. And Tim even told other bandmates that he saw him levitate. So I haven't heard anyone say that they saw him levitate, but band members saying that Tim told them that he saw him levitate. Honestly, I think it was that
I mean, this is the same guy that was handing out tabs of acid to
yeah,
the.
right, yeah,
so
exactly.
let's be clear. Yeah, exactly.
But I think there was something to that, though. That's the only thing that makes sense to me is that Tim must have assumed that he was onto something if he was sort of more dynamic than himself,
So what were some of the fundamental beliefs of Rationale culture? Like what were the driving beliefs? Like I get there's UFOs on the cover of the book, but were there like any like sort of foundational beliefs to the culture itself?
Yeah, fundamentally the idea is it's a little bit sort of around the ancient aliens kind of concept, if we've heard about that. The idea is that humans are not from planet Earth, that we got exiled here somehow, some point, and that our goal is to become sort of cleansed so that we can return to our mother planet, which is not that much different than Scientology. And Scientology, for the record, comes after. Scientology, started in the 40s and 50s. This, Manuel Jacinto Coelho started in 28, is when he founded Rational Culture. And so it's a combination of these sort of ideas of like ancient aliens, but it's also mixed with Afro-Brazilian traditions, which I think why it really gained purchase in Brazil in particular, in the sort of the wearing of white, the sort of the musical ritual traditions. The difference is that I was grounded in a book that you could read, which is literally why it's called Rational Culture, because it's rationalized. It's been put into word form. It's not about traditional Afro-Brazilian religions are about a ritual. There's not a book that goes along. There's songs and dances and there's rituals, but there isn't a book. There isn't some place to sort of check the text, and that's sort of the adaptation that Manuel Jacinto Coelho developed when he founded Rational Culture, is sort of merging this modern idea of us not being from planet Earth with these Afro-Brazilian traditions. So it really it felt comfortable to a lot of Brazilians who were familiar with the colors and the shapes and the nature of Afro-Brazilian religions, but it was also very New Age, in a time when that was super appealing as well.
So let's talk about what happened when he starts falling in love with this culture, becomes totally enamored with it, becomes his life to the point where he decides I want to make my album about this, I want to start singing about this, I want to make all the lyrics about this. How did his bandmates react to this? How did the label react to this when he turned this album in? What were their thoughts?
So first with the bandmates, it was a somewhat gradual process in terms of he took his sort of time coming to the point where he was all in. But by the time that he had decided he was all in, there was a couple tenets of the culture that he followed, and that he then made sure that if you wanted to be in his band, you needed to follow as well. So dressing all in white, abstaining from drugs, and to some extent alcohol, but definitely drugs. And this was a band that was literally, smoking weed in the studio all day, every day, usually tripping all day, every day also. This was like part and parcel of their process going into this. So for that to go cold turkey, no red meat, no extramarital sex, and you needed to read these books, and there were more than, this is volume 1, in the final iteration of the series, there's 1,000 books. So you were expected to buy and read all 1,000 copies, and if you ever listen to the lyrics to these songs, it's often talking about ler y reler, read and reread. So you don't just get to read it once. You just got to keep on reading these books.
Well, I mean, how are you supposed to reread if there's 1,000? Like it's just like that's pretty.
Well, the idea is that you get deep enough, then you've become. They had a number of different phrases. So you get demagnetized is one thing. So,
right.
And you achieve rational immunization. So to become fully immunized from the rational culture, it was through the process of reading the books. So it was very much part and parcel of the religion was reading the books. Now, of course, you had to buy the books, and they weren't free. And so that clearly became something that, in retrospect, people pointed out as being, maybe there was something else going on here.
Absolutely.
About this whole scheme.
Just maybe.
But so the thing is, though, the band members, almost all of them went along with this at the time for a number of reasons. One, it was Tim Maia's band. And again, going back to the idea of Tim Maia being the James Brown of Brazil, if you wanted to be in the best band in Brazil playing soul and funk music, it was Tim Maia's band. It was an honor to be in Tim Maia's band. And he was known to fire people and hire people on whims, so it was never a guaranteed thing.
Another parallel with James Brown.
Yeah, he was a pretty brutal band leader in terms of his whims. And the other thing is that a lot of the band members I interviewed for the book were mentioning that things were kind of crazy right before then. I mean, crazy with the band. I mean, they were going hard. They were partying hard all the time. And so some of them were like, this was kind of a godsend to like be given permission to take a break. And
really
some people even said that it might have saved lives. Now, some people also say that Tim did that on purpose to take a break. I don't believe that, because as soon as he left it, he went right back whole hog into the lifestyle he left before. So I don't think he intended it to be a break for himself, but I think his band members appreciated the breather.
And what did the label have to say about all this when he turned the album in?
Well, so I think they caught wind to it before it was totally done, was the situation. And I'm pretty sure by my research that Tim attempted to keep it a secret from the label as long as possible so that he could continue to use the, state-of-the-art recording studios and whoever engineers that they had on payroll to work the decks. And so you see the very first song that came out is called Que Beleza. It came out on the first record. It came out on the second record too in a different version, but it was the first single released. And it's the only song from both these records that isn't explicitly about rational culture. So it's a little bit vague. Que Beleza means what a beauty. And it's a pretty, sort of mystical kind of song, but it doesn't quite go over the edge of being like, what the fuck is this about? It's a little bit more open-ended.
It sounds to me like that was the emotion he felt after he got to book 1000.
Yeah.
Just like, what a beauty,
No, and so yeah, he read a lot of the books, but the 1000 book series didn't get completed until I think it was the late 70s that the guy finally finished, edition 1000. But what ended up happening, I think, and it's hard to sort of deduce because the memories of people aren't so great back then, is that they finally sort of got caught wind of the lyrical content that was coming out as he was starting to re-record the vocals, and they confronted him about the record. And his keyboard player, Dom P, told me, I write about it in the book, that they had a meeting with him, and Tim was notorious. Again, we talked about how he was a tough character to deal with, in business-wise. He wouldn't take any crap from anyone. That they expected him to blow up when he said that if they were going to tell him that he couldn't put out his record because he had a contract. In some version he had the rights to put out this record, and so they were prepared to sort of deal with the big blowback. And Tim surprisingly was extremely calm, cool, and collected, and basically said, "No problem. How about you just give me the tapes, and I'll walk." And considering that they had yet to press the record, market it,
that's where all the real costs
kind
of come in.
Come at the tail end. As much as they lost that advance they gave him, which he ended up giving almost entirely to the religion anyway.
Right.
I think they decided to cut their losses, let him walk with the record. So strangely enough, Tim was signed to RCA, yet never released a record on RCA.
Well, what's funny too is he gives them, he then sort of, this turns into this thing where he's not only donating, money probably from his advance, from that $300,000 advance, but sort of other money that he's, earning in and around this time period that the band's touring and all of that stuff. Like money is going towards this thing, and he's giving them credit for putting the album out and supporting him when in fact it's actually kind of his own money that's being the thing that sort of funneled back to help him.
Yeah, because there was even, I've asked this question a lot, sort of like, how did they end up getting the tapes back? And Tim even is on record somewhere saying that he gives credit to Manuel Jacinto Coelho for buying the tapes back. But I can't help but ask the question, well, wasn't he buying it back with the money you gave him? So, like,
exactly.
Whose money is it really?
Exactly.
And it's also worth noting that as things kind of go along and Tim stays in the cult, his bandmates who are along for the ride because they want to be in the best band and maybe they're appreciating this opportunity to sort of, you know, detox a little bit, they're not getting paid. While Tim has, you know, he's got, you know, money in the bank from before, he's still getting royalty checks from all of his old records, so he's still got money coming in, but the band members would normally be getting paid for either session work or for live tours, which they weren't doing any at this time. So these band members were really sort of treading water, and then once things kind of went on for a while, Tim started to see that his more talented and more in-demand, you know, band members were getting, you know, picked off by other producers, other bands to play because they were going to get paid. And as much as it's nice to be in Tim Maia's band, if you don't get a paycheck from it, you got a family to feed, and you got to make your own decisions.
For sure, for sure. What was the public reaction? Because obviously he had been a pretty big star in Brazil up until this point, and then you come out with this album about reading the book and ancient aliens and all kinds of crazy stuff. Like, what did they, you know, what did the public think of it?
Well, I mean, you gotta, it's so hard in this day and age in 2019 to imagine what it was like back in 1975 when the media landscape was totally different. So really things did not travel that quickly in terms of the story of Tim making this transition from one thing to the other. People didn't know. And people didn't know about the albums that came out because they didn't end up in the record stores that they would go to, you know, because this was ended up being put out independently and distributed independently. It's important to note that Rationale Volumes 1 and 2 are the first independently recorded and released records in Brazil, period. Before anyone else did anything independent, these were the very first ones.
Wow.
And so he paved a whole way in terms of, you know, the distribution of an independent record is a whole nother thing. If there's no, you know, infrastructure for that. So people in Rio and to extent people in Sao Paulo might have known that he'd put out these records because the distribution existed and maybe there was some media coverage. But what ended up happening is that Tim took the Racionale records on tour to smaller towns, and people had no idea that Tim wasn't going to be playing the hits from the first 4 records, let alone that he'd be playing songs like these. So there was a total disconnect. And so I write about sort of the years later, the rediscovery of these albums in the 90s is so important because literally people they might be Tim Maia fans and not know of the existence of these records for 2 decades.
Yeah, and it was, and you know, when you think about it in the course of a recording artist's career, I mean, this was probably about a 2-year period that we're talking about,
18
right?
18 months by my account. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's not like, okay, you could disappear or go off the grid as an artist for 18 months and then come back and people might not know that you put out, you know, new music, or you put out music in that time period that they didn't know about. For time's sake, I'm going to hop ahead to Volume 2, which I understand when I read in your book was distributed door to door. Was that the same for Volume 1 as well?
Volume 1 and Volume 2 were distributed literally door to door, sold on the streets. He would have, consignment deals with record stores.
Real independent.
I mean, it was like it was like Too Short out of the trunk of your car independent. Yeah. I mean, it was, you know, and it's important to note, there's Antonio Adolfo, who's another Brazilian musician, gets credit for being the founder of the independent music industry because he released a record called Feito em Casa, Made at Home, a few years later. But I have it on record, I have it in the book, Antonio Adolfo saying that he talked to Tim before he did that and you literally got the list of stores. You got literally the notebook that had sort of how Tim did it himself. So it was entirely hand done. There was no business manager. It was him and his bandmates going door to door, knocking on the door, selling the book and the record, proselytizing for rational culture, stopping traffic. I mean, it's sort of a Hare Krishna style, like at the stoplights, you got a moment, $5 will buy you a book and a record kind of a sales platform. So it was, it's not a surprise that these records were forgotten, because after he left the cult, he owned the rights because it came out on his own label. He had no intention or desire of reissuing these for, the obvious reason I can imagine, that he was embarrassed by the experience and it didn't bode well on his story.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that, because what ultimately happens is, Tim sort of falls out of love, with rational culture, and I won't give it away because I do want people to, read the book, but he sort of, has this, falling out with the culture, and what happens in this aftermath? Because like you said, he doesn't, in later years, he sort of almost disavows association. He doesn't want to be, sort of associated with this moment in time and this point in his life.
I mean, yeah. So, by my account, he was all in for 18 months total, and so, you ask about the distribution for Rationale 2. I think it's important to note that the reason that Rationale 2, for all you record heads out there, is more rare than 1 is because he had less time to distribute it. It was closer to the end of his run that he was really, pushing these out physically. And so at the end, when he was all done, he threw in the towel, and I won't give away the reasons except for to say that if you know anything about any cult ever, it's kind of the same reasons. Something about maybe the cult leader not practicing what he preaches. But Tim then disavowed this whole thing and told his band members, all the people he was working with, to literally take the books, take the records, and throw them in the dumpster. So a lot of the copies of these records ended up in the dumpster. And the one thing that I write about in the book that I'm still waiting to get proof of, but it's so intriguing, I can't help but mention it. Dom P, the piano player, talks about a box of singles. In Portuguese we call them compactos, little 33-inch, 7-inch records, 33 RPM, 7-inch records. And one in particular that was recorded during the Rational period at the very end, but by the time that they sent it back from the record pressing plant, Tim had already moved on. So they basically took this record directly from the pressing plant and threw it right into the dumpster. He kept a box, he says, and it's at his mom's house, and I still haven't seen it or got access to it, but he claims there's a entirely whole other single from this period that is yet to see the light of day because it was recorded in this limbo. So
speaking of that, there is sort of this other, collection of recordings that's associated with this time period, and that is, sort of referred to as, Rationale Volume 3.
Right.
So can we talk a little bit about that? Because was that officially released, or is that been sort of a reissue, or what's up with Rationale number 3?
Well, yeah. So Rationale 3 is exactly what it sounds like, in the sense that it was going to be the follow-up to the first 2 volumes. And what's important to note differently is that, like we said earlier, the volumes 1 and 2 were recorded as a double album. So all of the instrumentals were done while he was still getting high and living a very secular lifestyle, and recording at RCA, and then the lyrics were changed. Now, by the time you get to Rationale Volume 3, he was very much in it, and everything was recorded in that context.
Sober.
Of being in Rationale. And so it was sort of a follow-up. They went and they got an independent recording studio, started working on a follow-up, And what ended up coming out is almost a complete album. It's sort of like an extended EP. It's not quite the same length, but it's like 5 or 6 songs. And they're very much in the same vein. I mean, I can't say that I like it as much or more than volumes 1 or 2, but if you like volumes 1 or 2, you will like volume 3 as well, there's no question. And so what ended up happening is that years later in the 90s, a guy, he was actually the son of the engineer at the recording studio that Tim recorded these albums in, was cleaning out the studio and found a reel-to-reel tape that said Tim Maia on it, no other markings on it. And this guy, being the son, being a fan of Tim Maia, said, well, let me just hold on to this, I'll deal with it later. And he held on to it, and eventually it found its way to a record producer and musician by the name of Cassine, who's a big-time record producer in Brazil now to this day, who's also a huge Tim Maia fan. And he passed it to Cassine, who knew Tim's catalog well enough to know that these tracks had never been released before, and by virtue of the lyrics on them, were clearly from the Rational period. But it was also unfinished. It was an 8-track recording with 7 of the tracks full. So it was clear that he was saving 1 track for the strings, the string arrangements. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up working with the Tim Maia estate, and they put out a box set, I think it was 2012, of all of Tim Maia's albums, and they included Rational Volume 3 as basically the bonus disc in there, where they took the original recordings, and then Cassine worked with exclusively musicians who had worked with Tim while he was alive to recreate and sort of touch up the parts that had been messed up. So Paulinho Guitarra, who played on all of the Rational tracks, who plays the Ernie Isley style fuzz guitar.
Yeah, which is really interesting. Actually, Eduardo, I was speaking to him from Human Head, and he was mentioning to me, like, during the time that Tim was recording this album, he was really influenced by the 3+3 album by the Isley Brothers, which is classic $5 record for everybody out there.
Yep.
And it's amazing to me, like, now when I listen to it, that it can become so clear. I'm like, that's exactly what it sounds like. It does sound like a Isley, like an early '70s kind of Isley Brothers, definitely 3+3 sort of era, referential. So it's I love making those connections and sort of figuring out where the artists sort of made those connections themselves in terms of the inspiration behind them. Why are these albums sort of like still controversial as far as the estate is concerned of Tim Maia?
Well, because they're recorded for his independent record label, they are still controlled by the family, and so Tim's son Carmelo is the guy who is holding the purse strings and calling the shots in terms of anything that was recorded for the Soroma label. Now, what ended up happening was that, for all of you who saw the City of God film when that came out, Cidade de Deus, when it came out in Brazil, the very last scene, the last song, is O Caminho do Bem, which is from Rational Volume 2. And it was the first time that any Rational music had been reissued. And it was after Tim had passed away, which is notable. And when that happened, Tim Maia's estate took all the money for that license. And it turns out that song was not even written by Tim. It was written by his bandmates. But, to give Carmelo the benefit of the doubt, maybe he didn't know. But if you find the original, I'm not sure, Chan, if your copy that you just got has the insert, but if you got the insert, it has the who wrote the songs. And so Paulinho Guitarra, Beto Cajueiro, and Serginho Tromboni, if I'm not mistaken, were all band members. They wrote that song. And they didn't get credit at the time, and they brought that up, and they've been, in pursuit of basically, restitution for the money for these songs that have been reissued. And so, Luaka Bop put out a box set, a compilation of Tim Maia's work. That's the one that most people might know about. I worked on the liner notes for that. And there's a lot of songs from Rationale on that compilation. And, you know, for better or worse, Luwaka Bop, you know, worked with Carmelo, and whether Carmelo paid these other guys or not, I mean, I'm pretty sure he didn't. And that's the beef that is ongoing around this. And it has a lot to do with the fact that it's independently held. I think if it was held by, you know, a major record company, there'd be a little bit more maybe care to who the songwriters of record were for these records.
No problem. Well, Alan, thank you for sitting down with us and talking about this wonderful, interesting, strange album from Tim Maia. It's called Rationale, Volume 1 and Volume 2 for the 33 1/3 series. Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, RC. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Live Convention 19, Cratery Record Exchange. You know what it is. Shout out to our folks at Timecode TV. Holler.